As many of you may know, the relationship between a landlord and a tenant is crucial in the property management world. When this relationship is positive, it makes things much easier for both parties. However, when it's not so good, problems can arise that affect the landlord in numerous ways. In this guide, we'll be discussing the best ways for landlords to protect themselves from tenant harassment, including the most common things that tenants do to harass landlords and how to deal with them. So let's get started by first defining what we mean by landlord harassment. When somebody thinks of harassment, they will likely think of something very harsh or extreme. However, harassment can be as small as making hurtful comments or disturbing other tenants. This is an excellent example of harassment, as it is extremely inconvenient for the landlord and could even lead to an eviction. Another way that landlord harassment can occur is if the tenant violated the lease terms or any other rules that apply to the rental unit. This is harassment as the tenant is completely going against the rules stipulated in the agreement and can cause the landlord a lot of trouble. Other common forms of harassment against the property manager or landlord include lying about rent payments, causing multiple noise complaints, causing excessive property damage, making threatening phone calls or emails, refusing to evict the property, and violating other tenants' rights to habitability. Although some of these are more extreme than others, they are all considered harassment and should be properly dealt with by the property owner, manager, or landlord. Now, if the landlord is being harassed, there are a few things that they can do to deal with the bad tenant. But there's also many things that should never be done by the landlord. Let's go over some of the things that should never be done as retaliation by the landlord. This is how to not deal with tenant harassment. Before going over the most effective ways to deal with these troublesome tenants, we need to go over some of the ways that you should definitely not do it. Threaten the tenant back. One of the most important things to note is that if you are being threatened by the tenant, then you should never threaten them back. If you are being threatened, it is essential that you maintain your professionalism and respond in a calm and mature way. The reason that threatening the tenant is never a good idea is that you can then have a lawsuit filed against you. This is obviously not a favorable course of action for the landlord and should completely be avoided. Change the locks of the property. If the tenant is harassing you while still residing in the rental property, it is never a good idea to change the locks. Not only will this escalate the situation, but it's actually against the law. So if you do change the locks, you can end up having to deal with a lawsuit. Therefore, it is recommended that you deal with the situation in other ways. Remove the tenant's belongings. Just like changing the locks of the property, removing the tenant's belongings is also against the law. Since the tenant has the right to quiet enjoyment of their home, the landlord barging into the property and taking all of their belongings is definitely not allowed. Thus, even if the tenant is harassing the landlord, other courses of action must be taken. But what should the landlord do when they are getting harassed by the tenant? In this next portion, we will be covering the best ways to deal with the troublesome tenant. How to deal with tenant harassment. Now that you know about the worst ways to deal with tenant harassment, now we can go over the best ways to do it. Asking the tenant to stop. The first step in dealing with any problematic tenant is to kindly ask them to stop. You can do this by sending them an email, a letter, message, or anything that can be recorded. It is essential to make sure that all communications are recorded, as they could be used in court someday. Sometimes the tenant will come to reason with the landlord and will agree to stop the harassment. This usually happens if the landlord clearly explains the consequences that they will face if they continue the harassment. If they agree to stop, the landlord and the tenant simply continue to coexist until the lease is expired. However, if they do not agree to stop, the landlord may move on to more severe methods of dealing with the harassing tenant. Start an eviction process. If the tenant refuses to stop the harassment, the landlord may be left with no choice but to begin an eviction process. An eviction process can be very costly for both the tenant and the landlord. It can also be a very lengthy process and can even lead to violent altercations. The first and most important step is to send the tenant proper notice. This eviction notice should be a written notice and should alert the tenant that they are being evicted and let them know what rights they have in the process. From there, the landlord must follow the legal guidelines to make sure that the entire eviction goes as smoothly as possible. If these laws are not followed, the landlord can end up in really big trouble. If you want to read more about your state's landlord-tenant laws, be sure to visit DoorLoop's laws page to learn all about your state's landlord-tenant laws and eviction laws. Contact the police. If the tenant assaults you or threatens to do something that puts you in any form of danger, you should most certainly contact the police. The reason that the police must be contacted is that the landlord has been put in danger, so they require protection. This could lead to the tenant facing legal consequences and therefore being evicted from the property. If the threats were especially threatening, or if the landlord still feels in danger, a restraining order should be requested. For this, however, the landlord should keep a copy of the police report to help their case. These are the main ways to deal with a tenant that is causing trouble. But one question remains: how can all of these problems be prevented in general? In this next portion, we'll go over how to prevent having to deal with problematic tenants in general. How to avoid dealing with tenant harassment. Once you have managed to deal with the tenant that has been causing trouble, you may be wondering how to avoid having to deal with it again. While you can never be sure about how a tenant is going to behave, these methods should give you a solid idea. Let's go over some of the best ways to make sure that you are getting a good tenant. Run a thorough background check. Before moving on a tenant, it is always advised that a thorough background check is run. A background check allows the landlord to discover any criminal background, eviction reports, credit reports, or anything else that could affect the landlord. It is important that a trusted and reliable source provides this service, as the landlord would need the most accurate and updated information possible. Contacting previous landlords. Another great way to get an idea of how the tenant will treat the landlord is by contacting previous landlords. The previous landlords will be able to tell you everything about that tenant's rental period, including any problems or disputes. If the tenant has no previous landlords, the employer can also be contacted. Although they are not a landlord, the employer can give insight into how the tenant behaves themselves and if they are reliable. And that's a wrap for our video on how landlords can protect themselves from tenant harassment. We hope you found this guide helpful in understanding what landlord harassment is and the best ways to deal with it. Remember, handling tenant harassment can be a difficult and complex process, so it's important to approach it with care and caution. We encourage you to take the necessary steps and protect yourself and your rental property. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more helpful tips and tricks from DoorLoop.